Whenever I start working with a new gun that I'm planning to review, I will inevitably end up changing something. I might put in a different set of sights or change out a hammer spring or something like that. I just like to experiment a little bit when I'm doing a review. And whenever I talk about making these changes to a carry pistol, or any self-defense gun really, I know I can count on at least a couple of people in the comments having some objections. And I get that. It can be easy to mess up your gun or make it unsafe if you modify the wrong parts without knowing what you're doing. And there's a possibility of some legal implications if you ever have to actually use a modified gun in self-defense. So some people would just prefer to leave their self-defense guns exactly the way they come out of the box. But there's a problem with that approach. It's often based on the false assumption that when a gun is designed, all the features on it are put there to make it the best possible self-defense tool. And that's not really how things work. Mass-produced firearms are designed by engineers with heavy input from all kinds of other people in the company, like marketing guys and accountants. On some very rare occasions, they might consult someone who could be considered an expert shooter or maybe even an experienced self-defense instructor. But even in those cases, those experts don't get the final say in what features go on the gun when it finally rolls off the production line. A perfect example is the serrations that you sometimes see on the front of trigger guards. They were originally put there because some people would advocate wrapping the support hand index finger around the trigger guard for better recoil control. In reality, that really doesn't help at all, and I don't know of any respectable self-defense instructor who's taught a technique like that in probably over 20 years. But you still see those serrations on a lot of new pistols. And it's not because it's a good idea to use them, but probably because somebody at the company thought it would help them sell a few extra units. So that's why I don't really have any problem modifying my handguns. Most guns made by the reputable manufacturers are probably adequate in their stock configuration, but that doesn't mean that they're optimized for the serious shooter, and a lot of times they have features that are just really not all that well thought out. On top of that, every person is different. There's always going to be aspects of a gun that don't really fit well with my shooting style or my hand size or my eyesight, so I usually change a couple of things. Now, I don't like to modify stuff just to be different or out of sheer curiosity. You definitely want to be cautious when you're making any changes to a self-defense gun. So when I do make a modification, it's usually for one of three reasons. First, it has to offer some objective functional advantage. This would be things like increasing the magazine capacity or making the gun more reliable or more accurate. If I can improve the effectiveness or the functionality of a gun without spending a fortune or without compromising the gun in some other way, then I'll consider it. The second reason I might modify a gun is to make it easier to carry. These modifications are a lot more personal and subjective, and they tend to be pretty small changes. Sometimes I'll swap out parts to make a gun less prone to snagging on clothing, or I might use a file to just lightly smooth over sharp corners on a rear sight or on a magazine base pad. And finally, I sometimes modify a carry gun if it helps my performance with that gun. So if I want to be able to shoot faster or more accurately or reload quicker. This would be things like adding grip texture to make the gun less slippery, or changing the sights so they're easier to see, changing the magazine release so I can reach it with my thumb. These modifications can also be kind of subjective, and you have to be careful here because it's really easy to try and change the gun to compensate for bad technique or lack of ability. It takes some experience and discernment to know whether the thing you want to change is a reasonable modification or just a way to cover up a bad habit. Usually when people tend to go overboard, it's with modifying the action, changing the trigger so it's smoother or lighter. That's where a lot of the legal anxiety comes from too. Now, I personally think the legal concerns tend to be a little overblown, and I don't have any objection to modifying the trigger on a carry gun in principle, but I try to be really careful. I stick with drop-in parts from reputable manufacturers. I don't go cutting on springs or filing internal parts just to find out what happens, and I also don't want a really light trigger pull. For me, on a carry gun, I want it at least 5 pounds or more. And of course, when you make any changes on the gun, you really have to go out to the range and run a couple of hundred rounds through it to make sure everything still functions before you carry it again. Most of us, myself included, give our gear way too much attention instead of focusing on more important things like technique and strategy and mindset. But sometimes having the right gun configured the right way can make a measurable difference and give us some advantages that we're just not going to get any other way. So we have to strike that balance. We can't get too wrapped up with our gear, but we also have to be willing to change things up if that's what's holding us back.